Canadians, remember, have a powerful connection and remembrance of the Khalistan movement back in the day because of the enormous atrocity of the Air India bombing back in June of 1985. Throughout the referendum campaign, for several years now, Sikhs for Justice and its supporters have consistently praised, glorified, and held up as heroic the terrorist actions of Khalistanis back in the day. They choose him as the poster boy for the referendum campaign. Parmar is, by a large measure, the worst mass murderer in Canadian history. People are driving $50,000 trucks flying Khalistan flags. Are they going to go and live back to live in Punjab? So I do not see these people going to Punjab and to fight for the independent state of Khalistan, much less living in Khalistan. What is this Khalistan anyway? Is it a democracy? Who's running this new state? Is it the people who think that Talwinder Parmar was a big hero? A mass murderer? Only Sikhs are supposed to be voting in this referendum. In order to vote in this referendum, you have to be a Sikh over the age of 18. Well, what kind of referendum is that, where it's limited by your religion?
Hello, a very good evening. Very good evening. Welcome to Swarajya Conversations. I'm your host, Sharan. Today I'm really privileged to be joined by Terry Milewski, who was a senior correspondent with the CBC, and he is the author of a fantastic book titled Blood for Blood, 50 Years of the Global Khalistan Project. Terry, appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much for making some time for us.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm looking forward to it.
First of all, Terry, I would like your comments on the recently held referendum by some Khalistani groups in Canada. Normally, a lot of these theatrics happen just for publicity's sake, and there's a lot of activities around election corner because there's a lot of polarization going on, even in Canadian politics. But this time, the Indian diplomats had to sort of give an advisory even to Indian students saying that things may not be okay in Canada in the near future, so watch out. So, is it actually as serious as they claim to be?
Well, I think that to a great extent it's unserious. I say that for this reason, that, for example, if you scan the Canadian papers for reporting on this referendum, and I've done that, it's, to put it mildly, extremely thin. That is to say, there's almost no interest whatsoever in the mainstream Canadian media in the story of this referendum. Canadians, remember, have a powerful connection and remembrance of the Khalistan movement back in the day because of the enormous atrocity of the Air India bombing back in June of 1985. I won't go in too long about that, but my point is simply that it's not that Canadians are unaware by any means of the history of the Khalistan movement, and particularly its powerful base in Canada, where, of course, the two bombs that were involved in the Air India bombing were placed by Canadian citizens from Punjab. So that's the first thing that tells you something, I think, that Canadians are not really very exercised about this. They're not following this story. They do not see this as something that's so serious that tomorrow, as a result of this, there's going to be a new breakaway independent Sikh nation torn off India. They don't see that. They don't take that very seriously. The second reason I suggest that it's not very serious is that most of the publicity about the referendum has emphasized that, look, this is democratic. To quote Sikhs for Justice, the group that is organizing the referendum, we believe in ballots, not bullets. What's wrong with democracy? Well, nothing controversial about that, except that there is. And here, you'll forgive me if I go on just a little bit. because it involves some specifics, and it's always
Yes.
important to produce evidence. And my point is this, that in its iconography, in its propaganda, throughout the referendum campaign, for several years now, Sikhs for Justice and its supporters have consistently praised, glorified, and held up as heroic the terrorist actions of Khalistanis back in the day. And I mean that they are specific. For example, when they began the campaign, they named what they call the Canada headquarters of the referendum campaign, the Shahid Talwinder Parmar voting center. Parmar, of course, as you will know, was the mastermind of the Air India bombing, a shameless atrocity, a massacre of completely uninvolved civilians who had nothing to do with his struggle for an independent Khalistan, and who were blown out of the sky on an Air India flight 182 off the coast of Ireland. And they celebrate his name. They choose him as the poster boy for the referendum campaign. Parmar is, by a large measure, the worst mass murderer in Canadian history. That's
Right.
that tells you something. And I'll just give you another couple of examples. One would be the naming most recently of the voting center for the current round of voting in Brampton, a suburb of Toronto, Canada's largest city, as the Shahid Harjinder Para voting center. Who was Harjinder Para? Well, he was a Khalistani thug and killer who notoriously was involved in the near fatal beating of a fellow Sikh in Toronto, Balraj Deol, who was in favor of the Longowal Agreement. He was calling for peace, and for the crime of calling for a peaceful compromise, he was beaten nearly to death by a gang of thugs, including Para. Para then went on to training with the Khalistan Liberation Force under Avtar Singh Brahma in Pakistan in the late 80s, in the 86, 87. And he is pictured in video proudly pledging allegiance to Brahma, training on heavy weapons, rocket launchers, and the like. And he is featured again in the propaganda for the referendum campaign as a big hero and a martyr. Also recently, the head of Sikhs for Justice, Gurpatwant Singh Panun, of whom I'm sure you're aware,
Right.
he has starred in videos praising various other martyrs. He did a video, for example, I am Dilawar. Who was Dilawar? Of course, you'll recognize the name. Dilawar Singh was the assassin who blew himself up, and murdered Beant Singh, Chief Minister of Punjab, in 1995.
Yeah.
So time and again, and again, and again, and again, the supposedly ballots not bullets theme is completely contradicted by their own propaganda in setting up this referendum. And this, I think, only serves to remind people, particularly Sikhs, of the very heavy price that they paid for this violence and why they're not likely to be agitating soon for an independent state.
And there is selective sensationalization, especially in terms of if you look at the cartography of Khalistan map that's been put up by Sikhs for Justice, they never demand parts of Pakistan that was originally demanded. So as far as the Pakistan side is concerned, they're very mum about it. But when it comes to claims on the Indian side, they're very vocal about it. So this does seem very one-sided and questionable to begin with.
It does raise a lot of questions, doesn't it? I mean, if the point is, and they say this is their point, to re-establish, I'm quoting, to re-establish Punjab as an independent Sikh nation, well, what they're talking about is the heyday of Maharaja Ranjit Singh 200 years ago, the Sikh Empire, as it was, which of course was mostly in what is now in Pakistan. What was the seat of the empire? Lahore.
Yeah.
Where was Guru Nanak born? Nankana Sahib. These are sites which are fundamental to Sikh history and culture, but they don't claim those for Khalistan, do they? Instead, they make very large claims in the most recent map, which was produced at the end of October of last year. Very large claims, not just Punjab, but Himachal Pradesh, large parts of Rajasthan, Haryana, now they're adding parts of Uttar Pradesh.
Right.
They want to have their capital at Shimla.
Yes.
Shimla, what is Shimla a great historical Sikh city? I don't know what that's all about. But you get my point that
Yeah.
there has to be some reason, doesn't there? There has to be some answer to the question that you raise. Why are they not claiming these places? Why are these people places? Well, here's what they say in answer to that question. They say, oh, well, we're only interested in having our vote in areas with a Sikh majority. Of course, there used to be a Sikh majority in Pakistan, but the Sikhs have been progressively driven out by discrimination, by the kidnapping and forced marriages and forced conversions of Sikh and Hindu girls and Christians in Pakistan. Pakistan is not exactly a welcoming place for minorities, and the Sikh population has plummeted in Pakistan. So it's very convenient, to put it mildly, that they say, oh, well, we're only going to have the vote where we're in the majority. Problem, they're not in the majority in most of the areas that they claim in India.
Yeah.
So again, they contradict themselves. It just doesn't make any sense. I mean, Rajasthan, I don't think it will be news to most Indians, is not a Sikh majority.
Yes. Recently, there was an unfortunate assassination of of an artist, Sidhu Moosewala, in
Yes.
Punjab, and I think the Indian investigation led to the conclusion that there were a lot of international links with Canada, especially gangsters in Canada like Goldie Brar. But when you look at this from a Canadian national security point of view itself, isn't this a problem for Canada more than problem for India? Because at the end of the day, because of divisive politics and appeasement politics practiced by some politicians and political parties, today Canada itself, faces that threat perception from these groups.
I do think that it's unfortunate for Canada that secessionist groups do well in Canada. And I do think that there has always been a suspiciously close connection between the Khalistani world and the criminal underworld, the gangster world. Uh, for example, when the independent Khalsa school was set up by Referendum Singh Malik, one of the Air India suspects who was acquitted at the trial, when it was set up many years ago in the early 80s, the whole idea, according to Malik himself, and again I'm quoting, was to keep Sikh kids away from secular Canadian society. They were the other. They were something else. They were apart from the rest of society. And you do find, it's most unfortunate, that there is a significant proportion of the Sikh diaspora population, particularly in areas of Khalistani influence, who get involved in crime. This is contradicted again by the great mass of the Sikh diaspora, which, as you well know, all over the world, including in Canada, has been very successful, law-abiding, tax-paying, have been prominent in the professions, in the bureaucracy. They've done very well for themselves and generally are regarded as extremely good citizens, except for this very small minority. And I emphasize this is a very small minority of the Sikh diaspora that we're talking about that
Right.
seem to be interested in this. But to your point, yes, there is a problem for Canada in any community where there is a suspiciously high level of crime. And it does seem that most recently, for example, Malik, the founder of the Khalsa school, who was murdered in the middle of July in a contract hit, it does seem that involved organized crime. I mean, you and I don't know who to call if we want a contract killer, but these people did. So they were connected with the criminal underworld, and so was he. And he, of course, was the main financier back in the day of the Babbar Khalsa, the terrorist group which blew up Air India. So it is a problem for Canada, but if I can add just one proviso, I wouldn't exaggerate this because we have many similar problems in Canada. We have other groups that are engaged in crime. And as a national security question, I think the Khalistani movement is sometimes exaggerated by the Indian side. The
Right.
Indian side, as you have seen in the course of this referendum campaign, have issued great statements saying Canada must crack down, Canada must act against this referendum, Canada must stop it, silence these people. Well, that's not how it works in a free society. We have free speech, and as long as these people are not being violent, why can they not campaign for an independent Khalistan? Let them, and you might do much better from an Indian point of view by letting them fail. Let
Right.
them let them vote and let them fail to win.
I think obviously keeping the reactions from the media aside, sometimes today in the day and age that we live in, the media can be very sensational in that sense. What is more concerning is that the Indian government, perhaps for the first time, has actively given out an advisory to the Indian students, and obviously it would be done after much consideration, and a lot of inputs that they would have received. Otherwise, these sort of episodes keep on recurring, and you do not really see any reaction from the Indian government side or the Canadian government side for that matter. Which leads me to my next question. As compared to the threat perceptions perhaps in the 70s or the 80s, when there were a lot of bombings and much more activities, do you think that the activities of the Khalistanis has reduced considerably over the next few decades?
Yes, I do, except for rhetorically and digitally. What has changed is that they are no longer blowing up planes, thank God, but now they are all over the internet, and they're polluting Twitter with bots, and they're hurling insults at their enemies, and they're making a lot of noise. But for the most part, they're not engaging in violence. I mean, we have seen this is attributed allegedly to Khalistanis. I've seen no evidence of it, but the graffiti at a Hindu temple in Toronto, for example, most
Yes.
recently. Well, okay, that's bad. Uh, I don't. It seems likely that Khalistanis were involved. I don't know who else might do it, but leaving that all aside for lack of evidence, you still have to wonder, okay, well, graffiti at a temple, is this what the Indian government is concerned about? That this is a real danger? This is nothing in comparison with what we used to have in Canada. It's nothing in compared to the beatings and killings and rampant crime that we used to have in the 80s and early 90s in Canada associated with the Khalistan movement.
Right. No, but the other point that a lot of people are raising is that when you compare a lot of the crimes to which the Indian diaspora is victim to, especially those that live in North America, you see that only in Canada and especially by the Khalistanis, you still face a lot of these attacks and insults and slur. I don't know if you've come across this video from the US, which was about a couple of weeks ago, where this person who clearly belongs to the Sikh community, he was
Yes,
extremely radicalized, and in a Taco Bell, he was insulting another Hindu man. He was calling him a piss
yes,
drinker
I did
and
see that
whatnot.
video. Yes.
So when incidents like these happen, obviously it is shaping up to something which is concerning a lot of people, because largely the Indian community is there to do business, are there to do jobs, they work in the service sector, and they're the people who like the quiet kind of life. So which is why I think the government's reaction maybe also should be considered for a lot of people. How would you react to that?
Yeah, I think it is of concern. I did see that video. It's quite shocking, and this is why I emphasize the undercurrent of violence behind this ballots not bullets theme that they claim to espouse on the part of the referendum organizers. This does lead to incidents like the one you describe, and it does enable and promote these kind of hate crimes. There's no dispute about that. I simply suggest to you that when this results in the Indian government telling Canada to basically suspend freedom of speech in Canada, I say to you that's a non-starter. Get real. And in that sense, the Indian government, they know exactly where Canada stands. Canada's position is that we respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of India. We're for a united India, but people are allowed to campaign peacefully for an independent
Right.
state if they want to, and we're not going to throw out freedom of speech because of this rhetoric by the Indian government. And most Canadians would support that position. I support that position. I don't see why people can't be allowed to campaign for a referendum. Keep it peaceful. Where I object is the open and venomous reverence and adulation even of terrorists who have massacred huge numbers of civilians. That, to me, is a stain on the Khalistan movement, which should be erased, not promoted.
Yes. And why do you think that all of this has been dragging on for 4 5 decades? Usually, even if you look at, I was speaking to Phil Gursky a few months ago, and we were discussing how he handled a lot of the Al Qaeda recruits when they were arrested in Toronto and other cities during 2001 and 2. And there was a lot of de radicalization programs. So even when you look at the amount of people that have been convicted and are in jails, and today they're out of jails because they've served their time and all of that, you see that the numbers are gradually decreasing because a lot of the Western campaigns in the Middle East have also decreased in that sense. But I think a point of concern is that the recurring pattern with which a lot of the Khalistani incidents are in the news, that is a point of concern, especially because it also upsets the bilateral ties between India and Canada, which have been souring over the last few years.
Yeah. I mean, on your last point, the poor state of relations between Canada and India is a real concern. India we need India more than India needs us in terms of the future that's coming towards us now very quickly.
Right.
We need to be friends with India, and India needs to be friends with the West more, and Canada included. But the issue now, it seems to me, is that the de-radicalization has, in a sense, it's been the reverse. In Canada, where there's been more radicalization on the internet, which is words, not actions, for the most part, there's been more radicalization on the internet rather than less. And this has happened firstly because it's free.
Right.
Nobody has to make any particular effort to just
Yes.
get on the keyboard in the morning and throw out some insults at the Hindus or whatever they want to do on Twitter.
Right.
It's free. It doesn't count for very much, and it raises some other questions. How much of this radicalization is real in the sense that these people are going to engage in seditionist or separatist activities or even terrorist activities in Canada or in India? Well, so far we don't see very much, do we?
Yeah.
We see flags. People are being offered money to fly a Khalistan flag. Well, so what?
Yeah.
I
Terry,
mean,
I
does that
actually
mean?
understand where you're coming from. And I think you're completely right when you say that it's a bit exaggerated in the media. I think the bifurcation lies here. The bifurcation is that in Canada, things have stabilized to a large extent, and the intelligence and the military have actually done a fantastic job of cracking down on a lot of these groups. But there is a resurgence in the threat perception by the Khalistanis in India, and there have been many incidents over the last 3 to 4 years which have concretely proven that there's been a lot of lives lost. So maybe it's that state of concern that India has, which is why when you hear things from North America, we are a little concerned, because we may think that, especially because of the linkages and everything that today has been proven, it may lead to a problem in the future. So maybe it
Yeah,
is
yeah.
just that futuristic.
Yeah, it certainly did lead to real problems in the past. I mean, that's we're worried about the same thing, of course. Canada and India both worried about the same thing, that these people get carried away and go too far if they are allowed to be encouraged, if they are not criticized, if they are not called out for their reverence for violence, for example, and for violent terrorists through the history of the Khalistan movement, then we're going to be in for bigger problems. This is a legitimate fear. But I personally question whether, if you examined the real purposes of the referendum and of the campaign behind it, I mean, tell me, how many people believe that a lot of Canadians are going to leave Canada,
Yeah.
their rather prosperous lives in Canada, where you saw the video perhaps of the truck rally in favor of the referendum. A
Right.
lot of rather expensive trucks, weren't there? I mean, so people are driving $50,000 trucks flying Khalistan flags. Are they going to go and live back to live in Punjab, where many of them have never lived? We're talking about a lot of people who were born in Canada
Right.
and like Canada. They've got free health care. It's a prosperous country, and they are not. I do not see a movement to move back to Punjab,
Right.
and I
The
certainly don't
most
see a
simple
movement to move
question
back
can be,
to an
why do they
independent.
do it then?
Why do they do it? Well, it's status, street cred. It's called in North America. If you
Right.
want to be seen as a big shot, a tough guy on the streets of Brampton, uh, you hold up the name of Harjinder Para, the terrorist who massacred, what was it, 38 Hindu farm laborers. They were dragged off a bus in Lalru, was it 1987, and then in the same weekend massacred another 32. That's 70 dead in one weekend, thanks to Para and the Khalistan Liberation Force. If you want to be a tough guy, you hold up his name. Oh, he's a great martyr of our cause, and you strut and you gain street credibility in the community, in one section of the community, by being a bit of a gangster.
Yeah.
This is attractive to a lot of young men these days. Well, it always
Right.
was, wasn't it? But all I'm saying is I don't like it. All I'm saying is that I do not see these people going to Punjab and to fight for the independent state of Khalistan, much less living in Khalistan. What is this Khalistan anyway? Is it a democracy? Who's running this new state? Is it the people who think that Talwinder Parmar was a big hero, a mass murderer? Well, I think a lot of the people who are really dedicated to the idea of Khalistan are dedicated to the idea of a theocracy. And I
Right.
don't think a lot of Sikhs want to live in that theocracy. Remember, too, one thing that we haven't mentioned before is that roughly 58% of the population of Punjab is Sikh.
Yes.
Only Sikhs are supposed to be voting in this referendum. In order to vote in this referendum, you have to be a Sikh over the age of 18. Well, what kind of referendum is that, where it's limited by your religion? I mean, we're not against referendums here. We had two referendums in Quebec. It wasn't
Yeah.
limited by religion. What, it's only for Quebec Catholics? I mean, that was never even contemplated, that only some people would be allowed to vote. So there's another reason why I think you have to be very skeptical of the purpose of the referendum, who's behind it, what kind of Khalistan they envisage, and whether any of these strutting young men seeking street cred in Brampton, Ontario, would ever go to Khalistan if it ever existed. I doubt that very much.
Right. Thank you so much. I think you perfectly summarized a lot of the things that even a lot of the people in India have reacted to once they saw the referendum. But my parting question to you would be, Since the relations between India and Canada are extremely bad at the moment, and we've seen how the Prime Minister Trudeau was treated when he arrived in India, it was really not good at all. How would you say is the first step towards normalizing relations between the two countries? Do you think a political change in either of the two countries would enable that, or is there any hope for the current governments to actually make it happen?
Well, you'll forgive me if I'm not going to lecture you on Indian politics, but I will say a word about the Canadian question. And that is, yes, there is something that Canada can do, and they could start by not doing what Trudeau did on that infamous visit in 2018 to India, where he notoriously had on his guest list for a glittering diplomatic reception no
Yeah.
less than a convicted Khalistani would-be assassin, Jasper Latwal, who was convicted of shooting a Punjab cabinet minister in 1986 on Vancouver Island, and is not the sort of person you want on the Prime Minister's guest list, much less posing for selfies with the Prime Minister's wife, as he did in Mumbai on that trip. That was a blunder, a serious diplomatic blunder by the Trudeau government. And all the parties in Canada, I'm sad to say, are guilty of the same sin. That is, looking the other way. They say, okay, well, if they're going to vote for me, I'm going to turn a blind eye to what they're doing and saying. As long as, and they think that what they're doing is winning Sikh votes. Actually, they're winning Khalistani votes, and those are not the same thing at all. Remember that in Punjab, and a lot of people don't realize this, they think that Sikhs are Khalistanis, and they confuse the two. Remember that in the most recent Punjab election, the only separatist party running, Simranjit Singh Man's splinter group, they won what, 2.5% of the vote? No seats.
Yeah.
I know he has a federal seat now. I give him credit for that, but they want. I mean, the BJP, a Hindu nationalist party in a Punjab Sikh majority state election, won 3 times as many votes as the separatists. Can you imagine that? And then the election before that, they got what, 0.3% of the vote or something? I mean, microscopic. You could barely detect it. I mean, none of the above did better than the separatists. So it's important to remember just how, in what low esteem the Khalistan movement is held by the great majority of Sikhs. And to
Right.
remember that we're talking about a small minority which has mastered the art of making a lot of noise, and they have succeeded in getting politicians to listen to them. And if the Trudeau government, the Conservative opposition, the NDP, which is led by Jagmeet Singh, of course, who's got a history on this issue, to put it mildly, if they all said, look, we're going to stop this. You don't get to influence the government. You don't get to dictate the narrative of Indian-Canadian relations because you're a Khalistani and you say you're going to vote for us. There are a lot of other Indians in Canada. There are a lot of Hindus in Canada as well as Sikhs. And we're not going to play your game anymore. We're not going to sing your song in return for these promises of votes. We're going to draw the curtain over that sad past. And next time a Canadian Prime Minister goes to India, you will not see any convicted Khalistani terrorists on the guest list for the diplomatic dinner.
Hopefully that will happen and the relations will get better in the future. Terry, I just wanted to say that you're not just an inspiration in Canada for many, but even in India, we look up to you. And hats off to all the work that you've done. And thank you so much for giving us your perspective on what's actually happening in Canada right now.
Well, thanks for listening. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Viewers, please do let us know what you thought about this in the comment section below. This is your host, Sharan, signing off. Until next time.